Now, despite all of the economic and social problems in the United States today, by most measures, they still lead the world. President Obama gave an interesting speech in the swing state of Colorado today, which tapped into America's deep-seated desire to stay number one.
We have the capacity to meet any challenge because we've still got the best workers in the world. We've got the best entrepreneurs in the world. We've got the best scientists and researchers in the world, and the best colleges and the best universities in the world. No matter what the naysayers tell us, no matter how dark the other side tries to make things look, the fact is there is not another country on earth that would not gladly trade places with the United States of America.
With the possible exception of Australia, of course. But that idea of American exceptionalism is deeply rooted in their national identity and their particular brand of American nationalism. Nobody knows that better than Anatol Lieven, senior editor at the National Interest, professor in war studies at the Department of King's College London. He's also a leading expert on modern America. He's just written a new edition of his acclaimed book, America, Right or Wrong. He's in Australia as a guest of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Tell us, nationalism in the United States, I guess when we sort of think of nationalism, we probably think more of patriotism, flag waving, doing well at the Olympics, sort of USA, USA, USA. What is American nationalism? How is it different to other forms of nationalism?
Well, in some ways it isn't. I mean, one branch of American nationalism is rather close to French nationalism. It must be said, something that pleases either the Americans or the French to hear. But, you know, out of the French Revolution, this idea that French nationalism embodied universal values and represented democratic institutions which were of value to all mankind, that's at the heart of American nationalism as well. And you have something of that in India too, that Indian democracy is something for the whole of Asia. It's not just an Indian thing. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's a lot of feeling in America, at least in recent decades, it wasn't true till the 1950s, that you shouldn't really talk about American nationalism because it's pejorative. But I frankly think that's a bit silly because, you know, we talk about Indian nationalism in a positive sense, you know, the positive values of Indian nationalism. So why not talk about American nationalism?
Does China pose a particular problem for American nationalism, that notion that the rest of the world wants to be like us? Because perhaps unlike the Soviet Union, certainly in the last couple of decades of its existence, China is doing rather well economically, taking a very different approach to doing it.
Well, if that continues, and it is, of course, a big if, but if China does continue to grow in the way that it has, yes, that will be a big challenge, because it will be a challenge to the very deep American sense that America is the economic model, you know, that the American economic way is the best and the most successful. And yes, because the Chinese so far have resisted rigorously, you know, democratization and so forth, and yet have done so well. Yes, it will also be an ideological and cultural challenge, but it is, of course, a big if. Yeah. You know, clearly, for a good many Chinese, American values are very attractive. I mean, political values, not just values of materialism. And we don't know what's going to happen in China, but you can already see, obviously, deep unease in large sections of America over what's happening.
And a political challenge as well, of course, given that Washington has been unable to reach agreement on a whole lot of things, not passing budgets, not agreeing to how they can perhaps kickstart the economy and so on. You've been looking at how the last few years with the rise of the Tea Party has sort of fed into American nationalism. Has it changed in the sort of post-9/11, post-GFC world?
It has, but I would argue that the Tea Parties are essentially a continuation or a new manifestation of a radical conservatism in America, which has shown itself periodically, you know, over the years for a very long time now, and which comes up whenever core groups of the American population feel really under threat, either culturally or economically or demographically, or all three. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, it's all three, and in some ways to an unprecedented degree. The stagnation and then sharp decline of middle-class incomes in America is quite unprecedented. I mean, it's not been as deep as the Depression, but on the other hand, it's gone on and on. And also what is so frightening is that even when the economy as a whole has grown, the benefits have not been passed on to many ordinary Americans. That hasn't been true since the later 19th century, or even you could say it's never been true in America. And so you do have this mood of embattled fear and also bewilderment, because these people, who have been brought up, after all, to believe that America is best at everything, can't quite understand what's happening to them. And so partly out of this, you do get, I think, these demonologies which come out, these absurd stories about Obama, when in fact Obama, as so many people in America have said, has actually governed as a kind of moderate Republican, as an Eisenhower Republican. And yet he's accused of being a communist, a Muslim, and so forth and so on.
How much of that would you say is racial, or is race just another form of difference and unfamiliarity? How do you sort of, to that question of, is the Tea Party racist, I suppose?
I think race is part of it, but not quite in the same way as in the past, because, if you look at, for example, fundamentalist churches in America, they are now willing to accept blacks and other races in a way that certainly would not have been true, 40 years ago. And I've always said about Obama that it didn't surprise me at all that there was a black president of the United States. I'd expected that fairly soon. What really surprised me was that the first president of first black president was not a successful general. Because blacks have really made their way in American government very largely through military service, because, of course, that emphasises their patriotism, their adherence to American values. Now, Obama, of course, he's totally committed to American values, but, of course, for the white conservative middle classes, his cultural background does look strange and alien. His interracial marriage, which is still a bit of a sensitive point, brought up in Indonesia, Muslim middle name, clearly an intellectual, and black. So it's all these things together which I think create a kind of potential demon figure.
Do you sense in the United States now that the ground has been prepared for a conservative comeback, if that means morning in America again, that we can once again have a leader who says that no, we're not retreating from our traditional place in the world, we are still the shining city on the hill? Is that Mitt Romney this year?
Well, clearly that's what a lot of Americans want, and there's tremendous rhetoric of this kind in the Republican Party. But of course, so many Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, didn't want Romney. They don't really believe that Romney represents this. They would have preferred a much more radical figure from their own ranks. But they were persuaded, as part of the process, that such a figure could not be elected, because the centrist voters would not vote for him, and of course Latinos would never vote for such a figure. So they've come up with a figure, but a figure who for them doesn't, in fact, represent the kind of revolution they want. When we look back on the past decade or so, from 9/11 through the global financial crisis into the Obama era, do you think that will be seen as the tipping point for the United States, or just another downturn that is corrected by this extraordinary engine of innovation and reinvention that has been the hallmark of the United States? Well, on the China front, it obviously really depends what happens to China now. If China goes on growing and overtakes the US and US relative power continues to decline, then I think 9/11 and the choices that Bush made will be seen as historically very significant. But of course we don't quite know what's going to happen to China. Things could go wrong there. On I am more worried in some ways about the domestic economic scene, because there do seem to be inexorable processes here. The decline of the middle classes, the concentration of wealth in a very limited section of the population, the offshoring of industry, all of these seem to be long historical processes which it will be very difficult for any American government to check. And if continued, if the decline of the middle classes continues, for decades to come, this will really undermine the American dream as far as these people are concerned. And well, obviously the social and political consequences of that could be very severe. Anatol Lieven, thank you. It was a pleasure.